This recipe is fairly unique and maybe not one that you'll find a lot of places, but I feel like it does a really good job of bringing out all the flavors in a traditional pesto that is in a totally whole food plant-based version. So I'll show you how to make it with and without oil. I give a traditional Italian pesto recipe made with basil in another video, which I'd refer you to watch first because it will make all of the different alterations we're making here make more sense. But you can also take that recipe exactly as it is and just substitute in the plant-based Parmesan that we made, and you'll have a simpler recipe. That one still incorporates a fair amount of olive oil, which is, you know, a heart-healthy oil, but it does add a lot of calories. This is a much reduced calorie version, although still very flavorful, lots of umami, you know, the saltiness of some of the other ingredients. We have healthy fats from nuts and nut butter, which adds some richness and creaminess that will be missing with the olive oil that's not going to be in there. And then similar to the other version, instead of doing a pure basil pesto, I'm going to replace a half cup of the basil with parsley, which will maintain a nice bright green even upon chopping. Basil tends to brown right away when you chop it, so it's a nice way to keep that bright green color. And the other thing I want to mention about pestos is that you don't need to make them with basil. You can really make them with anything. You could make them with other greens, which is the most natural, you know, alteration. If you're not quite, you know, confident in your substituting abilities yet, you might go with carrot tops. So, you know, those beautiful greens on top of fresh carrots you might see at a farmer's market that you just tend to toss. It makes a beautiful, tasty pesto. Arugula, other, you know, sharp greens with a bite make a good pesto. But you can also use things that aren't green at all. You could use, you know, red bell peppers make a great pesto. The carrots themselves make a good pesto. Anything that you like, but you also can then start to experiment with the nuts. You don't have to use pine nuts. You know, if I'm making a carrot pesto, I might use pistachios, which are really good with carrots. You know, you can use almonds, you can use walnuts, whatever you like. And, you know, if you're not sure what will go well together, you know, take a bite of the main ingredient you're going to make your pesto out of, and then take a bite of the nuts and see if they taste good together. And if they do, great. You know, put them together. I think people get really nervous about making substitutions in cooking, and you don't have to feel that way about cooking. Baking is another story, which we talk about in the baking sessions, but this is, you know, rich and ripe for experimentation. So the first thing I'm going to do, similar to the traditional pesto, is put our chopped garlic in a food processor. Now to the garlic, I'll add the parsley. Parsley is just a little harder to chop up, so I added a little earlier, make sure it's really good and well chopped, since I'm really trying to emphasize the basil flavor in this pesto, not parsley, so I want it small. And then some things that are quite different from the other recipe, I'm going to add some cashew butter. This is just for some richness, and, you know, ideally you'll use an unroasted one. You want it to just kind of blend in and add some body and richness that you'll be missing without having oil. It's actually a substitution I make in a lot of recipes if you're trying to cut back on oil. I mean, there's still calories in nut butter, but the proportion is much smaller. And if you just completely make something that's supposed to be, you know, a higher fat sauce without any fat, you'll be really disappointed. So you have to find that happy middle ground. And then to add some tang, you know, I think we don't think of oil as having a lot of flavor, but it actually does add a lot of different complexity of flavor. And olive oil specifically does have some acidity, so we're going to add some lemon juice to make up for that. And then we'll go ahead and blend this up, and then we'll add the rest of our ingredients. And I'm going to pulse this just to chop, but we want to maintain a little bit of texture. We don't want it to be totally smooth and pureed. And then you can see it's mostly chopped, but there's some big pieces of garlic and parsley up on the side. I'll tap down, make sure that those get incorporated with the next batch. I'm going to add pine nuts, so we're going to make it as a nice contrast to our traditional basil pesto. And then I'm going to add the basil itself. You can add it through the feeding tube. It's just a little faster if you do it this way. And then, you know, the other thing that we're replacing here, since it's totally plant-based, is the Parmesan. So it sounds really strange, I realize, but I promise it will not taste of what I'm adding. So I'm going to add, the secret ingredient here is a little bit of curry powder. So just a couple dashes. You do not want this to taste like curry, but it's just that mixture of spices adds like an umami sort of flavor that you're missing without the Parmesan. And then you can either add the plant-based Parmesan that we made in a separate recipe, Or the other thing that you can add if you don't have that, or you know hadn't made it ahead of time and you rush for time, is you'll also get a lot of umami, cheesy sort of flavor from this nutritional yeast. And this is a yeast product that's rich in vitamin B12, so it's a great source of B12, which is otherwise, you know, fairly low in a completely plant-based diet. I'm going to use the plant-based Parmesan that we took the time to make. And then you need to thin it out a little bit. So once this is chopped up a little bit, I'm going to pour in a little bit of water through the feeder, just enough to make it blend and chop. If you didn't mind, you know, making it with some oil, you could add a little bit as well and do it half and half if you wanted to like split the difference and have it be somewhat rich. But we'll go ahead and add the water. It actually drizzles in slowly, so it's not just pouring straight in. It says 2 tablespoons in the recipe or too thin, and so you just add a couple tablespoons. I usually end up adding more. The nuts and, since there's not oil in there, the nuts and the, if you're using nutritional yeast certainly, but the plant-based Parmesan actually do absorb some liquid, so you want to make it a little thinner than you would want it after it sat, you know, because it will thicken up as it sits for a few minutes. Scraping down the sides. It's so interesting. It smells exactly the same as the other one, which, you know, I'm sure people will only believe if they do it themselves at home, but it is, you know, striking how similar it smells. Okay. Still pretty thick. I'm just going to pulse in a little bit of water and I think we're done. And then you might think, this is a very strong flavored sauce. This is a lot of it. You know, you do have to make a fairly decent sized batch to actually get it to process in your food processor. So what you can do with the extra is you can line a ice cube tray with some plastic wrap or use a dedicated tray so that it will be very garlicky. There's no way to rinse out the garlic smell. And so you can put it in there. If you fill it all the way up, it's an ounce. If you put it about half full, it's about a tablespoon. And it's actually small enough that if you have some warm pasta, you know, or something else that you're making, it will quickly melt and just, you know, stir in. You don't have to defrost it. Or if you're putting it in a cold preparation, you just let it sit out for a couple of minutes and it will defrost if you're going to, say, put it in a salad dressing. And the other thing that you can do, of course, this only works if you're okay with having a little bit of oil in it, which I think it's worth the ability to store it and keep it green to do this, is I'm going to just take this out, put it in a jar. And what you can do is, you know, if you have the basil touching the air, it's going to oxidize or turn brown. We, you know, fix that partly with adding that parsley, but you can also just put a really thin layer of any kind of oil on top. I tend to use olive oil for making this, you know, in lieu of a traditional basil pesto, because the flavor lends really nicely, but, you know, really anything that's neutral would work as well. And that, preventing that air and the basil from touching, will help keep it green. So you want to tap it down and get some of those air bubbles out. You can also use your spoon to smooth it out if you need to. Still some air bubbles coming out. It's not a big deal if you don't get all the air bubbles out. Just the more you get out, the less browning you're going to have. And then if you take your olive oil and just put a really thin layer on top, you can keep that nice and green for about a week in the fridge. Sometimes it will go a little bit longer, but especially this one where you have less oil in it, it will tend to still brown more quickly than the traditional version. So you can't keep it for a super long time. But if you did want to avoid having most of the oil, if you're someone that's trying to avoid that, then this will actually solidify in the fridge. So you can just slide it out of the way, you know, scoop some of the pesto out, and slide it back over as a nice seal and store it in the fridge that way. So this is our plant-based pesto. And I encourage you to try it on some of the dishes that we'll share with you. So we'll put it on some zucchini noodles, otherwise known as zoodles. And we'll also put it on a type of high protein pasta because this stronger flavored pesto will really marry well with that. But you can really put it on anything that you can imagine. It's great in dressings as well. You know, it's kind of like a green goddess pesto type dressing. So with that, let's get to the pasta.